um, I'm just thinking, say zip code
Okay.
and zip code, and I'm trying to come up with a completely +1 positive correlation features. So
Right.
zip code of an area,
Uh-huh.
uh, correlating it with I don't know, median income of an area, for example.
Right.
So some of it basically is completely correlated +1 essentially, because if
Yes.
you're talking about Palo Alto,
Yes.
obviously Palo Alto zip code will have very high income people basically.
Yes. Yes.
So
Yes.
using
Correct.
either one of those features is good enough basically.
Yes.
Right?
So
Yeah, this
exactly.
is
So
on the same lines. I think the whatever example you gave, Kalpendu, that is an example of zero coefficient, because the temperature and the price are completely independent of each other. Is that right?
yes.
Perfect.
So the second variable that we introduced, which we picked up as an age hypothetical situation, is going to demonstrate the dependency, and we'll see how the correlation coefficients changes the distribution that you can see. Hello? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. 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 So, okay, where were we? Yes. So we created the covariance matrix, and as you guys pointed out, the correlation coefficient indicates how much and how much are the variables correlated, and if you can potentially drop off one of the variables. And in fact, it's not just that. So if the two variables are correlated partially, let's say the correlation coefficient is between 0 and 1, and I'm jumping the gun here because this was something I was going to cover later on, but let's assume that we have a correlation coefficient of between 0 and 1, then they are not completely uncorrelated, but there is some element of information that can be squeezed out of one of the variables. And how do you come up with that optimal balance of only the essential information from all the variables? So let's say the first variable you take as is, and whatever information is not available in the first variable, but it is available only in the second variable, only that small part of that information can be squeezed that out of this joint distribution. And the entire discussion is geared towards creating an intuition for that particular topic. How do you squeeze out just the essential information from correlated data? And as you'll see towards the end of this lecture, when we do this concept of data transformation, and particularly what is called as eigenvalue decomposition or singular value decomposition, that is a process of extricating this information from correlated variables into an uncorrelated set of an abstract data which loses its physical significance, but it has just the right amount of information from this correlated variables. Okay. So we go back to our constructing our probability distribution function, and okay, the main part of this PDF, completing the PDF, is to show you what this covariance matrix looks like. Right now, this covariance matrix is for two-dimensional data. If we had a three-dimensional data or five-dimensional data or whatever, we would have sigma square 0, sigma square 1, sigma square 2, sigma square n. So you have the variance of each of the variables along the diagonals, and on the off diagonals you have the covariance, row 0 1 of sigma 0 sigma 1, row 0 2 sigma 0 sigma 2, and so on. Right. So the covariance matrix is nothing but it's this kind of a matrix, and no matter how much data you have, both your vector representation of the data and the covariance matrices scale up simply in the dimension, but the underlying concept still remains the same. Okay. Okay. So coming back to our example, we make an assumption that the variances of the two variables are unity and the variables are uncorrelated. If this is the case, And so now we construct our two-dimensional probability distribution, and we call it as the probability of, by the way, if your, one more thing, with this assumption here, our covariance matrix becomes 1 0 0 1, right? You have your individual variances equal to unity and the covariances being 0. So this is called as an identity matrix. Whenever you see an identity matrix, you should be very happy. It simplifies things a lot, right? So for our example, let's assume that we have an identity matrix for our covariance. So again, going back to our formulation, where we have, let me cut this one. For a scalar variable, this is our PDF, and for the vector, we will have probability of r comma t given c equal to a is equal to 1 over 2 pi. We have an operation called as a determinant operation. If you can remember from your undergraduate days, when you had a matrix, there was a procedure to compute the determinant of the matrix. It's a slightly abstract concept, but for the maximum likelihood computation, just remember that, you know, pretty much we can ignore this part for now. And then we have exponent of the particular measurement xi minus the mean vector mu sigma inverse, which is the inverse of the covariance matrix, times t xi minus mu. Right? So what does this mean? This says how far is my vector xi, a particular measurement xi, which is now going back over here, any one of this entry xi over here, how far is this from my mean, similar to your scalar, right? How far is x from the mean? You take the square of it, and if you see, if you were to multiply this quantity with this one, you will see that this is a vector square, which is called as an inner product, and I'll show you in a minute how. And then you divide it, you scale it by the covariance matrix. So covariance in a scalar. So in a matrix form, you take this matrix of the covariance matrix and take its matrix inverse. Okay. What is a matrix inverse? A matrix inverse is not the inverse of each element of the covariance matrix. It is not 1 over sigma 0 square 1 over. It's not doing an division by 1 of all these entries. Matrix inversion is a very different concept, and we will leave it at that. But it is a very difficult computational problem and a very important one for multiple reasons. For our discussion, we will just leave it, and the best intuition you should have at this point is, if I were to have a scalar equivalent of this covariance matrix, it would be a single variance, and the inversion would collapse into a division by 1. Okay, so again, under the assumption that sigma is equal to an identity matrix, we have this probability is equal to, and discarding this constant value, we have e raised to, let's just put the constant value as k, e raised to xi minus mu t a. Both of these are vectors. This transposition, the t over here that you see is a transposition of a vector, and I'll tell you in a minute why. What does it mean to transpose a vector? Okay. Mu a. So what this is doing is, it's taking, remember this xi is actually a measurement which is ri and ti, and you are subtracting it from the mean of your price and the mean of your temperature. So I can write this as an element by element subtraction. It's Ri minus Ti and Ti sorry, Ri minus mu R and Ti minus mu T, right? And when I take this multiplication, it becomes a what is called as a vector inner product, right? So Ri minus mu R and Ti minus mu T. So I effectively made this vector representation, which is traditionally a vertical representation. I made it into a horizontal vector, and this became because of this transposition operation. And then I multiplied by the vertical. This is mostly terminology, minus mu T. And this operation is the inner product, is called as a vector inner product. It's interesting because if you go back to your high school or college days, and if you remember, you had a vector in this direction and a vector in this direction, and when you take the inner product of this vector, you can come up with the cosine of the angle between the two vectors. That's one interpretation. Not for our use right now, but what the inner product does is it takes okay, some IT issues here, sorry. Okay. It takes the first row. It takes this variable multiplies with this guy, and this variable it multiplies it by this guy, right? And so we have Ri minus mu R square plus Ti minus mu T square. Right? So this is basically the vector inner product. Now, why did we go through all of this math? Is to show you the following, right? What is this vector inner product? Is actually an exponent. It's coming from this exponent of the inner product, right? So if we bring back the exponential operation here, you see that this is an exponentiation of the sum of two quantities. And again, if you remember, exponent of the sum of two quantities is actually exponent of Ri minus mu R square multiplied by e raised to Ti minus mu T. Sorry, my mistake here. It has to be A or no. It was correct. Mu T square, right? What is this? This is the probability of R given city equal to A multiplied by probability of T given city equal to A, right? I'm discounting the 1 over constant factor over here. But in essence, what you saw is because of the assumption of the covariance matrix being identity, we could just remove it and collapse the distribution into the inner product of these two vectors over here, which resulted in our ability to express the joint distribution as a product of two distributions now. So in essence, probability of R comma T given city equal to A is actually equal to the independent, is nothing but the product of the two individual distributions. If I were to draw a picture for this, then I have, what does it mean? I have one distribution and I have another distribution. This is the price, this is the temperature T. What I do is I pick up a sample from this distribution, let's say this one over here, R0, and for this R0 has a probability, let's say 0.2, then the joint distribution, the probability of R multiplied by the probability of T is nothing but this probability over here multiplying this entire distribution over here. So then when you multiply this entire distribution by this 0.2 value, because it's a product of the two distributions, I'll see something like a curve over here, right? So what, again, to reiterate, this is the probability of R comma T, which is equal to probability of R times probability of T. This one is, and I'm just actually illustrating it for you, right? This is the mean, and this is mean for this guy. And what you would see here is, if you can imagine, let your imagination be more powerful, would see this is kind of a joint distribution. If you can imagine, it looks like a cone like this coming up. And I have a better picture of this. Over here, right? This is what it would look like. So you have one variable over here. You have one variable here, you have another variable here, and here you have the joint distribution of x and y is equal to probability of x comma to the probability of y. And at any given point of, at any given value of, at any particular measurement of x and y, you multiply the individual probabilities and you come up with a point on the surface of this cone which gives you the joint probability distribution. Right? Is this clear to everybody? Any questions? Okay. Now you could do all sorts of things, right? In this case, we assume that both of them have the same variances. What if one has a different variance than the other? Well, nothing changes much. And I want to drive a point here. So I'm going to redraw the picture. In this case, we have one variable with a very small variance and another one with a very fat variance. How does a joint distribution look like? It is going to look like something like now. If you can imagine, this is like a narrow mountain ridge. Let me see if I have another picture for you. You know, something like this. It's a compressed narrow ridge, right? But the point here is, if you look, because these two are still independent, the axis along which they occur, that's the axis along which this joint distribution is constructed, is parallel to your natural axis of your price and your temperature, this axis, right? So in this picture, for example, this is y, this is x, and the axis of this particular distribution over here is still aligned with the axis of your natural data, right? And we will see that when the data becomes correlated, this axis start to tilt around, and that's the visual intuition behind the correlation. Okay? So again, this is what is called as it's called as a multivariate normal distribution, but because we have two axes, it's called as a bivariate distribution. Now, why did we go through all of this? Okay. One more picture I want to show you before we venture into why we are doing all of this, right? So there's something called as a scatter plot and a contour plot when you are discussing when you see a multivariate distribution. Let me pull out another picture. Okay. This is the same two-dimensional distribution, but what you see in the bottom over here is the density of the measurements. What it says is that if your two variables are x and y, then the probability in the center is the highest. That means most of the data, you will find a lot of data in this particular combination of x and y. And as the probability reduces in this direction, which means that both x and y start becoming more and more sparser, and the occurrences of the joint occurrences of a specific value of x and y outside of this range of its variance starts becoming sparser and sparser. That's why you see very few data here, but a lot of data over here. So the plot that shows you the density of the data, the actual visual representation of where the data is located in your two-dimensional plane, is called as a scatter plot. Sometimes you want to connect all the regions where the probability is the same. So for example, imagine if I were to cut this plot with a horizontal saw perfectly in this direction. That means if you can imagine that I have this rectangle plate which is cutting through this two-dimensional plot, then the ring that I see here is a ring of identical probabilities. That means all these points over here, I don't know if you can see it clearly, on this ring have the same probability. And if I were to project this onto the xy axis, I would see something like a ring here. Then I cut another one. I make a horizontal cut somewhere here, and that would correspond to a ring of identical probability distribution projected on your xy plane. And then let me do one more over here. Right? Then I would see another ring over here. So these are basically contours of identical probabilities, and it is called as a contour plot. And all these plots help you visualize the distributions in at least the two dimensions. These are good to generate intuitions in 2 dimensions, but as I mentioned, most of the data is not 2-dimensional, it's higher dimensional. So the utility of all these plots vanishes pretty fast. Any questions at this point? Okay. Let's see, what did we cover? We did the 2-dimensional distributions, and we did the scatter plot. Okay. Okay, we still haven't decided why did we do all of this. So remember, we started off with our ultimate goal of computing this one, right? We want to compute the maximum likelihood equation, the joint probability of this one, compare it with the joint probability of this one. What does it mean to have 2 joint probabilities and comparing? Again, I'm going to, sorry for the poor drawing skills, but let's go and do it. Let me show you an example, okay, before we work out the math. Right? So we had this one, probability of R given CT equal to A, right? Now, in our past class, we had said that this was the probability of R given CT equal to B, and that we could come up with this neat threshold, and we could separate out the 2 classes very neatly by just looking at the threshold. Right? All fine and dandy, but in real life, that might not be the case. We might have something which is more like this one. Probability of R given CT equal to B. This is price. This is your probability of R times probability of T. What happens here? If you have a measurement of a certain dollar amount of the home, your probability could be, let's say, 0.4 versus 0.3, right? Very close probabilities. You will start making a lot of errors in this plot because the two distributions are not discriminative enough to make a very good decision. You'll see a probability of error going up. Now, what happens when let's have the case of probability of temperature given city A, and it so happens that the tier B cities actually came from a geography which had very different temperatures. Probability of temperature given city B was completely different, right? So what this plot says is that if I take a measurement from the city A, then, and if I look at the temperature distribution across my measurements of the houses, I see something like this kind of a curve. So for example, if I take the cities in the Santa Clara County, I will see probably this distribution. And the distribution comes from the fact that Cupertino versus Sunnyvale versus Milpitas has a slightly difference in the temperature. Versus this distribution comes from, let's say, Florida and the different counties in Florida. So the average temperature is higher, but there is still some distribution. And if I were to look at the joint distribution, I will see something like this. Okay, let me see if I can. I have this joint distribution of probability of T, R, and T given city A. And if I were to plot the same thing for the city B, what do I see? I see my joint distribution falling somewhere here, right? Now, at this point, I can very clearly discriminate between these two distributions. In fact, if I take a line, draw a line between the center of the two means over here and two means over here, and remember, what was this one? This was a vector representation, mu A bar, which was RA and TA, which was the average. It was a vector of the average temperatures, average price and the temperatures in city A. And the same thing we can come up with here, mu B is equal to RB TB, this vector, right? So this line over here is a line which is connecting the two centers. And if I draw a perpendicular line between these two, then this is my discriminating boundary. So all I have to do once I compute this discriminating boundary is to see where does my joint measurement fall. Does it fall on this side or this side of the curve, right? So if I have a specific vector composed of a specific price and temperature, I see, hey, my price is here and my temperature is here. My point falls on this side of the curve. So very high chances that this data came from city A versus similar exercise came from city B. This discrimination, this kind of discrimination is called as linear discriminant analysis. And let me see if there's a better picture again. Okay. This is a much better picture showing you have two distributions, 1 and 2. Okay. These are the contour plots of the two distributions. This is the decision boundary, the discriminating boundary. Okay. So what happened was the original single variable data was not discriminative enough. But the moment you added a second data, so all of a sudden you could very clearly discriminate between the two quantities. So now you might ask a question, hey, you know what? If I just were to look at the temperature, then I would realize, the temperature by itself is discriminative. Why do I even need to look at the price? Well, here is the case. When you're collecting the data, you're not aware of this. If this is a two-dimensional data, you can create all these beautiful pictures and visually look at it. What if you have a 30-dimensional data? You're not going to be able to beforehand know which variable has more importance and more discriminative value as compared to the other variables. And in fact, when you're deciding on what machine learning model to use, this is one of the very important criteria, because some models, when you run those models, they will actually inherently tell you that this particular variable or this particular variable set of variable had this much of importance in your discrimination. Certain models like neural networks do not give you that information. So while neural networks might be very powerful, they do not give you this kind of insightful information about the underlying data. And this becomes very important when you're choosing a data. You have to ask yourself the question, do I want this information? Do I want to see what is actually the most important data in my data set? What variable is the most important? And is my machine learning model going to give me that information? Okay. Any questions at this point? Okay, I think we are at a 1 hour boundary and we still have a lot of material to cover. Let me just quickly cover one material and then we can decide whether we want to proceed or not. We still haven't constructed, I mean, we are seeing these beautiful pictures, but we haven't constructed the maximum likelihood decision rule, which is going back up over here. Where is it? This one. Right? So let's just copy this. Over here. Okay. So when I have to do this, again, I do this simple thing, 1 over one over 2 pi, my determinant e raised to x minus mu a sigma inverse a x minus mu a transposition, and compare it with e raised to, sorry, over 2 pi determinant of the covariance matrix e raised to x minus mu b, because this is the second hypothesis, covariance matrix out of the data coming from the second hypothesis, x minus mu b, right? And under the assumption that sigma a equal to sigma b equal to identity, my decision making rule would be something like this: x transpose mu a minus mu b and equal to half mu b square minus mu a square, right? Or this equation, if you can look back into the previous lecture, this is exactly the vector equivalent of your scalar decision rule. What you're doing here is you take your measurement, you multiply it by a scaling factor, which is the difference of your means, and you threshold it against this particular threshold value, which is your square, the inner the square of your the difference of the squares of your mean vectors. That's it. If this was to be a multidimensional, if you had, instead of 2 variables, if you had 20 variables, the formulation would still remain exactly the same. You would have a mean vector, mu A and mu B. Each of this mean vector itself would be 20 variables, and you would still compare it with this particular particularly constructed thresholds. And this is your scaled up version of your maximum likelihood. Any questions at this point? Let's see if I have covered everything. Okay. So the next thing that I was planning to go into was to bring in a correlated variable to show how, for example, instead of the temperature, we had the age of the house. We would have a correlated variable, and what is the consequence? It will take, I believe, another half an hour. Can I have a voice vote on what we want to do? Do we want to continue for half an hour or want to push it to the next session?
We can continue.
Okay. Majority continue?
Yeah, I'm good as well.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, continue.
Okay, fine, good. Okay. Let me just see the chat, and if there are any questions I need to attend to. Okay, good. Okay. Is this clear enough to everybody? Any questions, any refresher on what we did today? Okay. So again, one more small point over here. How do we, is there a way to know which variable has more discriminative power over the others? Yes, there are several ways without actually having to compose a machine learning model or an analytical model along these lines. One of the techniques that I am aware of is called as, it borrows from the concept of information theory, which is called as mutual information. And it goes something like this. I have a variable which is again in our specific case is the city, and the city has its own distribution, which if you remember, it's a binomial distribution, probability of city A versus probability of city B. So there is some uncertainty in what the underlying city is. Which of the variables, knowledge of which variables, is it the temperature, is it the age, is it the price, is going to reduce the uncertainty in my random variable, the city, the most. Okay, you could use that as an indication of which variable has the most discriminative power, and that reduction in the uncertainty is called as, uncertainty by itself is an information theory. In information theory is called as entropy. Something with a large entropy means it has a lot of uncertainty. Something with little entropy is something which has very little uncertainty. So knowledge of which of the variables is going to reduce my entropy of the final classified values, which is the city, the most, is going to be my most discriminative variable. So even before running the machine learning model, you could do this analytical tools, mutual information or some kind of other correlation metric to identify which variable has the most discriminative power. Okay. So moving on to the case, now let's construct the case where instead of the price, I'm looking at the age of the house. Okay, so we're still going to construct a two-dimensional PDF, which is price, and we'll run age, right? So here we have probability of the price given city equal to A. So joint probability of age equal to A R comma A given. R comma A. Okay. Now here is the thing, right? Typically, older the house, cheaper it is, right? So in this case, a cheaper house will correspond to an age of a house which is typically on the lower side. So we will see that in this particular, let's say whatever is the dollar value of this equal to 200K.
Shouldn't it be higher side actually? The cheaper the house, the older the age.
Cheaper the house, yes, you're right. You're right. Perfect.
Yeah.
I always get confused with this, but yes, cheaper the house, older it is. Okay. So for a $200,000 house, an average age is something over here, and the distribution is about this much, right? What this means is, for a 200K house, you really are not seeing a lot of houses which are new, and for a 500K house is something over here, this distribution, right? For this one. Now what you see here is the probability of the age given a city is actually, you can condition it on the price, because there is a dependency. So you can actually, this is probability of age given city and the price is this distribution, right? This is where you're seeing the correlation come up, right? For each of your price values, you have a different distribution of the age. And how does this look in terms of our probability distribution, the plot, the PDF plots that we have been drawing out? So over here, let's do the same exercise. Okay. So if I were to draw this, then I take this particular value, let's say 0.2, and I have a distribution, this distribution over here. Actually, I don't know why I drew this very tiny ones. Maybe I should just draw them bigger. I have no idea why I did this. Each of this multiple distributions corresponds to a specific value of the price. Now, of course, there is an assumption here that the price is not continuous, and I'm measuring it only for specific dollar values, and I'm giving myself the liberty of creating that confusion. The actual price would indeed be a continuous variable, in which case this distributions over here will not have distinct peaks, but this will be more like this distribution would look more like something like this. And in fact, there is a name to this model. If the underlying distributions are Gaussian, then this model is called as a mixture of Gaussians. Okay? But for our discussion, let's just stick to the fact that we have very noticeable distinct peaks corresponding to a specific value of the age, right? Now, if I were to draw up the two-dimensional distribution, I would see that my average value moves along this particular axis. So I have my average value for a 200K house over here. So the joint average is somewhere here, right? The joint average for 300K house is somewhere here. Joint average for a 500K house is somewhere over here. Okay? And it corresponds to an age, a 200K house. Did I make a mistake here again? Yes. Okay. I'm going to start this all over again. 200K house, this is my average. 300K house, this is my average. Average is in the average temperature or the joint average. 500K house, sorry, age, this is the average, right? And if I were to draw the distribution, it would look something like this, right? So I don't know if you can imagine this. It is the same distribution we had over here, this one, except the axis is now tilted. Okay, and let me see if I have a better picture here. So if I were to look at the scatter plot, which is a representation of how the axis of this joint distribution is tilted, it would look something like this. For a zero correlated data that we saw in our first example of totally uncorrelated sequences, right? Something like this distribution, you see that the scatter plot or the contour plot looks more like a circle, right? Because the data in each direction is completely independent. So this distribution over here is completely independent of the distribution here. So you see a joint circle. Circle comes from, actually has a mathematical foundation. If you were to plot, if you were to compute the joint distribution, you would actually see that it represents the two-dimensional equation of a circle. Now what happens? In the extreme case where the age, okay, or before we go to the extreme case, okay, now as you have more and more correlated data, what happens is the circle starts skewing into along a line that represents how much is your correlation. Right? Actually, not really. Let me see how I can explain this. Let's take the extreme example. Okay, let's say the age is completely determinable by the price. That a $200 house, let's try it again. A 200K house, if you know the house, it exactly comes from a place where the temperature is known beforehand, right? So there is no variance in the temperature. No variance in the age of the house. Let's say this is a case where there is a gated community. All the houses in that gated community were constructed at the same time. So all of them have the same value, right? So there is absolutely zero variance here, right? 500K house, zero variance. That means if you know the price of the house, you can almost certainly figure out what is the age of the house. Okay, and the same thing over here, right? 300K. It's 500K. Right? This is the extreme case where the age of the house has absolutely no information in it. If you know the price of the house, you completely know the age of the house. In this case, if I were to draw the joint probability distribution function, it would be something along this lines. Right? This is the center, right? What this is that there is no variability by the age, so my distribution is pretty much a single plane like this. There is absolutely no variance in this direction. In the extreme case, this particular variable age has no contribution to my discriminative power. So this represents the extreme case of my correlation being close to 1. What is this correlation? This is the correlation coefficient that we discussed very early on. Where is it? the value of rho being okay, I think I lost it. But if you remember, we had earlier on the discussion where we said the value of rho could be -1 to 1. Well, here is the case. This is the case of a rho equal to 1. That means it's a completely correlated variable. In our case, the correlation is inverse. So we have rho equal to -1. Okay. Now, as the variability in age increases, so for example, in a 200K house, you have a slight variance in the age. You can start seeing this variance being reflected over here. So you will start seeing the fattening of the PDF of this PDF along this particular axis. Right? So in this picture, as your correlation reduces, you see more and more variability coming from the second variable, and that means that there is more discriminative power of the second variable. Is this clear? Any questions? Okay.
Can you please repeat the last statement again? Sorry.
Okay. So as in the extreme case where the second variable is completely explainable and completely correlated with your first variable, in our case, the age is completely obtainable from the price value, you will see that it has no variance at all, right? That means it's completely predictable. There is no variability when you condition it on the price. Now, it corresponds to a correlation value of almost unity. And in our specific example, because the correlation is inverse, it corresponds to a specific value of -1. Now, as the correlation begins to reduce, it means that the second variable, which is the age in this case, starts to show some variability for a given value of the price. And that variability is seen as a fattening of the curve along this axis, right? So if you move over here, you see that there is more variability in the second variable, and eventually as it approaches a completely uncorrelated distribution, you see that the correlation coefficient is 0 and your distribution becomes this particular distribution. Instead of being narrow, it starts fattening out and eventually it becomes a circle. And what it means is the variance along this axis corresponds to the variability of your second variable. Narrower the variance in this direction over here, narrower is the variance of the second variable, and narrower the variance means less predictive power, less information in the second variable. More variance in this direction over here means more variation in this dependent variable, and more variation means it has more predictive power.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
So now I'm going to do one more attempt of drawing this a little bit neater. So now, if you have this multiple distributions, right, and here I am plotting the axis along which there was most, let me see if I can draw this. Right? So it's something like this. You can imagine it to be, kind of a narrow ridge, which is pointing in which is not aligned to your primary axis, right? So these are your primary axis. These are the axes that you are used to in your day-to-day life. These are the physical entities. But now, when you do the when you look at the distribution, when you look at the contour plots or you look at the scatter plots, you find that your joint distribution is aligned across this axis. What I mean by aligned is the data is orthogonal in this particular axis, which is tilted from the primary axis. So along this axis, let me call this axis as E1 and E2. Okay? This axis are an abstraction of your underlying data, and what they say is, if I were to be able to construct this axis, then most of my variance is explained along this axis, along this new variable called E1, and a little bit of my uncertainty is explained by this new axis called E2. Okay? Remember, if I were to look at the raw data, I see, hey, you know what? My price has a big variance. Even my age, as long as I do not condition it over the price, has a big, large variance. Sigma A and sigma R. They are large variances. So if I were to not look at this, if I were to cover up my two-dimensional plot and just look at the individual variances, I would think both of these variables are large variances and both of them have a lot of explanatory power. Remember, if you look at this plot, larger the variance, more is their explanatory power. Lesser the variance, in the extreme case when there is no variance, the variable is completely explicable by the primary variable, right? So same thing over, so this plot over here, this new axis are actually telling me along this new axis E1, I have the most variance. So if I were to somehow magically be able to recreate this, then my distribution along this axis would look something like this. Okay. To be very sure, E1 has no resemblance on the age or on the price. It has lot of I would say information from the variable price, but it is not equal to the variable price. E2 is actually over here, and this is the distribution along E2. So what I'm trying to say here is the axis E1 is the transformation of the data along an axis which has the most information. Okay, and this might come from, mostly in our specific case, there is a very high likelihood that the E1 comes from, most information the E1 comes from the price. But in the case that the age has a little bit of a variance, it has a little bit of discriminative power, you want to extract out only that, squeeze out only that part of the second variable that has a discriminative power. All the rest of the information that is correlated with the primary variable you want to throw out. When you do that exercise, you come up with this second axis E2. So E1 has most of the information. E2 has that information which is not available from E1. And because both this information are completely uncorrelated, in this new axis E1 and E2, you find that the data is completely uncorrelated. In a two-dimensional thing, this is pretty easy to visualize. But for a second, think about the fact that you have 20 variables instead of 2 variables, right? When you construct this kind of a data transformation and you have 20 new axes now, you might notice that most of the data is aligned along the first 2 or 3 axes, and the rest of the 17 axes has very little variance or no variance. So effectively you can say that all my information is now collapsed into this small new axis, and I can throw away all the rest of the axis. Which means now I am effectively compressing or reducing the size of my data. And this is the foundation of what is called as the principal component analysis. This axis, this new axis, are called as the principal components of my data set. And they reflect what, where, along what axis, and how much is the information located along those axes. Does this make sense? This is a very important concept. If you can understand this, abstraction cannot insist how much important this principal component analysis is. It's almost at the heart of all engineering applications. You will see the following flow of processing. from machine learning to wireless, the projection of the coronavirus to recommendation engines, Google PageRank. At the heart of everything is this kind of a decomposition of your jointly correlated data along the axis, where the data starts becoming uncorrelated and squeezing out the essence of the data. So a typical processing is like this. You have the data X, which is this table that we constructed up over here. I think we're going to take another 10-15 minutes. We're coming close to the end. Let's just finish this off. Where is it? We take this table. Right? Let me see if I can cut this. We take this table, and from this table, we construct our covariance matrix sigma, which, if you remember, is the variance along the individual. In our case, in this specific example, it's going to be the age, and then you have sigma r, sigma a, sigma r, sigma a, and rho, right? For a 20 variable case, this matrix is going to be 20 by 20, right? Then oh, by the way, one important thing. So the process of transforming the data from the natural axis from the real world axis into this abstract new axis is called as a matrix decomposition. A matrix because you are working with the underlying covariance matrix, and decomposition because you are decomposing it into this independent uncorrelated axis. And the most prominent decomposition technique is called as the eigenvalue decomposition. It's called as eigenvalue decomposition. Right? There are variants of this. It's something is called a singular value decomposition. Both of these are related and both of these are almost identical. There are some subtle differences, but don't worry about it. Good. What the eigenvalue decomposition generates is you feed it a matrix, and let's draw a block diagram here. So you take the data and you compute its covariance matrix based on the data, which is this sigma. Okay? Then you apply this linear algebra processing, which is called as the eigenvalue decomposition. And when you perform the eigenvalue decomposition on your covariance matrix, you get two things. First, you get your axis, which are called as the eigenvectors. Let me just write the whole thing. And the eigenvectors are basically the direction in which most of your information is located. In fact, not most of the information, but the orthogonal or the uncorrelated directions of your underlying data. So in this case, we have two-dimensional data, so we have two orthogonal axes, but it could go to multiple. If for a 20-dimensional data, you would have 20 eigenvectors, and then you have something called as an eigenvalues. The eigenvalue tell you what is the amount of variance in the eigenvectors. Higher the eigenvalue, more is the variance, and hence more important is that particular eigenvector. That particular direction is more important as compared to the others. Right? So you take the data, you take the eigenvalue decomposition, and then you can decide to say that, I have a threshold, say gamma, and all my eigenvalues greater than this gamma are important. Right? So again, the eigenvalues is an indication of the variance along a certain axis. And I say that if the variance along a certain new axis is greater than the threshold, I want to retain those axes. Everything else I'm going to throw away. So when each eigenvector it corresponds to a certain eigenvalue. So every time, so when I decide to throw away a bunch of eigenvalues because they do not have a discriminative power, I throw away the eigenvectors associated with them, right? So then now I have a smaller set of eigenvectors. Let me call it as E hat, and a smaller set of eigenvalues called as E gamma hat. Okay. Then I apply a linear algebra technique called as the projection. And what the projection does is you take the data and you project the data onto these eigenvectors. What effectively you're doing is a new data that comes in, a new data that was not a part of generating these eigenvalues and eigenvectors, you are now mapping that data along this axis. And that mapping procedure is called as the projection operation. These are all the terms that come out of linear algebra. So what I want to show you here is how the fundamental maximum likelihood solution is now being helped by the procedures in the from the topics of linear algebra. So when you apply the projection, when you take the data and project it only on the limited set of your eigenvectors, that means you are only looking at the information along those subset of the eigenvectors that you thought was important, right? So you are, if for example, in this two-dimensional case, let's say I decide to drop this the second eigenvector altogether. I say, you know what, the variance along this axis is so small, I really don't care about it. I'm not saying that the variance is coming from the age or from the price. All I'm saying is when you combine the two variables and project it into a new direction, you have in one of the directions the variance is very little and I want to throw out. So now you are left with only one direction. When you project your data onto this one direction, you have a two-dimensional data collapsing into now just one single dimension, right? So when you have this projection operation over here, it results in reduced dimension data. Reduced dimension data means your underlying machine learning models now have to work with a smaller but a more essential set of data. This, if you're looking at neural networks particularly, or in fact for any other machine learning model, a smaller set of more essential data means your training times are faster and your model accuracy improves. Reduced data, that means if you want to compress your data, you know, let's say you're compressing audio signals or you're compressing anything else, you can do this principal component analysis, throw away that dimension of the data that doesn't have a lot of variance, and you can start reducing the size of the data. Another important fact, let's say in this case we have two directions. Again, from a 20 direct, if your data was 20 dimensional and you wanted to collapse it into, let's say, 4 dimensions, there's a concept called a subspace. That means most of your data is located in a small space of your entire data space. Again, this is an abstraction, but think of it along the following lines. You have a room which is 3-dimensional, and in that room you have a paper on which you draw a line. Now this line is located in a 2-dimensional space inside of a 3-dimensional space. So the subspace of everything that you draw on the paper is limited to 2 dimensions, and everything outside of this paper is basically noise. Now if you were to take a picture of this particular drawing on the paper, all you need to do is focus on that 2 dimensions. The rest of the things in the room are noise. So if you want to remove the noise, all you have to look at this subspace of your entire space. In the same thing over here, let's say that E2 had a lot of noise on it, and you wanted to throw away the noise, right? All you need to do is just forget about the whole dimension which corresponds to the noise only, and look at those dimensions where there is noise plus your information. And when you do that, you're able to get rid of a lot of noise. So there are a lot of applications in, for example, pre-processing of your data before feeding it to neural networks, where you have to denoise your signal. And one of the ways to denoise your signals is to do this subspace interpretation of the data, which is basically looking at which of this eigenvectors your data is, and which of the eigenvectors there is no data, and then throw away that data which is do not project your data onto those axes where there is only noise. So in conclusion, the concept of data transformation onto the axis which has the most variance is called as matrix decomposition, and a very, very important concept in the pre-processing of data before feeding it to the actual decision making. In fact, one more point, once your reduced dimension data comes out, you can actually run your maximum likelihood estimation or maximum likelihood detection on this reduced dimension data. In our case, if you were to reduce the dimension from 2 dimensions to 1 dimension, then you need a 1 dimension maximum likelihood data, which in our case would mean that the data is just simply this 1-dimensional data over here, and for the 2 hypotheses it would be something like this. And now you have to construct your maximum likelihood based on the distribution of this new abstract data, which is a different topic in itself. Any questions on this one? This is a little bit difficult topic to digest, because now we have to start thinking along this very abstract eigendirections which sort of lose their interpretation and lose their physical significance. But once you come to terms with the concept of this abstraction, this is a very invaluable tool. So I think we have covered most of the topics that I wish to. Forgot about a few ones, but I think we are way off our estimated time as expected. So I'm open to questions. Otherwise, we will wind up here.
Visualizing this is very, very difficult. It's like in 2 dimension, it's still okay, but as you keep on adding more variables,
yes,
just visualize this is like it's
no,
beyond.
so you have to stop visualizing it. You have to make your peace with the fact that beyond 2 dimensions, what we call as a hyperdimension, things starts to visualization start to fall apart.
But I guess most of the real world problems are in hyperdimension.
Yes. For example, if you were to look at the image classification, so we discussed about the data being a vector data, right? But the data could be matrix, like a picture, which is a 64 by 64 pixel. So the way to handle it is to vectorize the data, put the pixels in a stream. But now you have a 64 times 64, which is whatever that big number is. You have a data which is that big dimension.
Right.
But the beauty is, the information is still almost always located to a very small subspace. And in fact, there are tools that, if you were to look at just 2 dimensions of the data, for example, there is that classical problem of identifying the digits, right? The digits from 1 to 9 using a digit classifier. And in fact, if you were to look at the projection of the images of the digits onto 2 plane, you would actually, even the 2-dimensional visualization is very very discriminating. You would see that the number of 1, if I were to plot the eigendirection 1 and the eigendirection 2 of images 64 by 64, you would see that the numerical 1 is located here, numerical 2 is over here, 3 is over here, 4 is over here. Even in 2 dimensions, you can discriminate these things very well.
Banik, you just need to see the movie Inception with some beer. You'll be able to imagine all the dimensions.
I know, Jigar. That's the plan tonight now.
Okay. Okay, if you have any questions, just feel free to call me. We can discuss this offline, or just send me an email. And absent any questions, we should wind up.
So thanks, Kalpendu. This is like
Okay.
really.
Thanks, Kalpender.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you, Kalpendu.
Welcome.
Thanks, Kalpendu.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for attending. Bye.
Oh my God, this is complicated.
Thank you, Kalpendu.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.